Welcome once again to the official MUFON podcast. I'm your host, Richard Beckwith. Tom Whitmore has been actively involved in the UFO field since 1990 and has served on the MUFON Board of Directors since 1994. He is a retired financial analyst and assists the Board of Directors with strategic planning, administrative, and long-term issues. Tom takes a particular interest in the relationship between UFOs and the national security state, and he is currently undertaking a fascinating research project on the history of the MJ-12 affair. I am very happy and proud to welcome my friend, Tom Whitmore.
Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
I'm very happy to have you here.
Okay.
Of course, we talk all the time. But one of the things that we don't really get to talk about a lot is UFOs, the subject that we're so fascinated in as board members. We're really dealing with business all the time, and one would think that we would be talking about UFOs, but really we talk about board business. So I want to talk about UFOs because you know a lot about them.
Well, thanks. And, I think people out there in UFO land should also know that we're essentially a business board. And we handle administrative matters that oftentimes are not interesting when compared to UFOs. Right. And we do get to talk about UFOs at the symposiums when we get together.
Right. And of course, our private conversations involve the topic. But we really, as you said, we don't really get to talk about UFOs very much. And interestingly, you retired recently and took on a new job, and you are essentially a full-time researcher. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's true. I get up and I get the basics done in my apartment, and then I go to work. And I've a long time ago, a football coach, a pro football coach, said that they don't make touchdowns, they make first downs. And I finally cracked the code and realized that what I need to be doing is creating output. And so I started this pattern of writing white papers. And I recently published in September my first white paper, MJ-12, the Counterintelligence Angle. And I'm working on several other papers now. I'm doing research on those. So I have a goal to write at least 20 to 25 white papers. So I'm going to have my work cut out for me for a long time. Mm-hmm. And most all of them will be either directly or indirectly related to the subject of the history of the MJ-12 controversy.
And you've spent a lot of time on that. And I just read your most recent blog post. You want to tell everybody the location of your blog post, your blog, so that they can go and read the same things that we're reading?
Yes, my blog is called tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. That's tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. I started it when I moved here to the Washington, D.C. area in September of last year. And first of all, I was very excited because I've moved very close to the National Archives, and I can also catch public transportation downtown to go to the Library of Congress. So I immediately went to the National Archives and pulled the only MJ-12 document that's there in the archives, or MJ-12 related document. And I started my blog then. And I encourage anyone to take a look at my blog and see the things that I've been up to.
Yeah. One of the things that I admire about your work is that you're very detail-oriented, and you're clearly very interested in the subject. And there's reason, I think, for all of us to be interested in this subject, because it goes to the core of the matter of why intelligence agencies became involved in UFO research to begin with, and in particular with regard to MJ-12. That is a convoluted story involving all kinds of espionage and international intrigue. And you just wrote this most recent blog that I want to talk to you about, the MJ-12, the Counterintelligence Angle. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. So first of all, before we get into the meat of it, Paul Bennewitz.
he was sort of a bit player in all of this, and didn't some kind of bad stuff happen to Mr. Bennewitz?
That's part of the UFO legend and mythology. I'm working on an extremely detailed timeline of the Paul Bennewitz affair, and I'm up to 160 line items at this point, and I will be writing a white paper on it. Richard, I've gone through all the sources that I have direct access to that directly are related to the Bennewitz affair. And Paul Bennewitz was a physics-trained person who had his own business, Thunder Scientific Labs, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he lived directly next to Kirtland Air Force Base. Well, in the 1970s, there were cattle mutilations going on, and it's a controversial subject. There hasn't been a lot of direct connection between cattle mutilations and UFOs, but Paul Bennewitz got interested in that subject, and there was a lot of concern about cattle mutilations, particularly in the western part of the United States. And Paul Bennewitz had gotten to know, I believe, a state trooper by the name of Gabe Valdez, who operated in the area of Dulce, New Mexico, which is dominated by this rock fixture called Archuleta Mesa. And Paul Bennewitz became so interested in this that he took trips out to Archuleta Mesa and saw some strange things going on there. Well, he got back to his home in Albuquerque, and his wife told him that she had heard some strange sounds over their house. So he went out on their back porch and started, in the middle of the night, started looking at what was going on Kirtland Air Force Base. Well, he also got up on his roof and he started taking photographs, I believe some films, and he started taking scientific measurements of fluctuations in electromagnetic fields. And this was in December of 1979. At that point, he had convinced himself that he was seeing UFOs on Kirtland Air Force Base.
That is extraterrestrial spacecraft. He believed that he was seeing that, right?
Yes. And, combined with his interest in the cattle mutilation problem, he really began to think seriously that some really material activities were occurring with extraterrestrials and UFOs. And he approached Kirtland Air Force Base with his concerns. Well, this was in January of 1980. Concurrently, Richard Doty, who was an Air Force Office of Special Investigations special agent, had started working at Kirtland in 1979. And after Paul Bennewitz had communicated his concerns at Kirtland Air Force Base, he did meet with Kirtland personnel in October and November of 1980. And at that point, the Kirtland AFOSI, possibly in conjunction with other intelligence agencies, such as the National Security Agency, even the FBI, or the Defense Intelligence Agency, they began a series of countermeasures against Paul Bennewitz. Now, I would just like to say...
Tell us why that is, Tom. Was he seeing things that he shouldn't be seeing relative to developments taking place there? Why did they do that?
Paul Bennewitz was monitoring activities on Kirtland Air Force Base, I think both during the daytime at night and at nighttime. And on Kirtland, they were conducting a number of highly classified programs. I'll give you a couple of examples. One was they were using lasers to experiment on blinding Soviet satellites as they passed overhead U.S. facilities. Another thing that was being done was Kirtland was relaying information to Holloman Air Force Base who was reprogramming Soviet satellites to move them off of their orbits. So this is just very, very highly classified stuff. It's also possible that they were experimenting with and running drones on Kirtland Air Force Base. And it's possible that those were some of the things that Bennewitz was seeing. So, and we're told, it's the old saw, that what we see publicly is 20, 30 years behind what the military and what the government is doing. So it's possible that they were experimenting with drone prototypes that even possibly were saucer-shaped. So Paul Bennewitz was observing these things on Kirtland Air Force Base. And if you carefully look at the so-called Kirtland documents, which I think are suspicious in and of themselves, but they were documents that were released through the Freedom of Information Act. In those documents, it shows that the Kirtland people ran a counterintelligence check on Paul Bennewitz. Okay. Now, what we don't know is what the result of that check was, or at least I don't know what the result of the check was. And I don't know if no one else knows in the public. I don't know if we'll ever know what those results were. But it's my suspicion that the results of that counterintelligence check produced this program of countermeasures against Paul Bennewitz. Now, according to Richard Doty, Paul Bennewitz did not require a lot of encouragement to really go off the deep end in his assumptions and beliefs about aliens and about extraterrestrials, et cetera, et cetera. So this ultimately, to make a long story short, it ultimately resulted in Paul Bennewitz undergoing a complete nervous and physical collapse, I believe, in 1988. Now, Richard Doty has gotten the blame for this, and I'm not sure that that's entirely fair. Now, I'm not saying that Richard Doty is a saint, but Richard Doty was a sergeant, so he was acting under orders of people that at the officer level that were above him, both at Kirtland Air Force Base and from headquarters at the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and even Washington, D.C. So I think that that's something that we should keep in mind.
And this brings about the entire subject of counterintelligence, which, of course, Rick Doty was a major part of with respect to UFO groups and so forth. And I agree with your assessment that we can't really call Mr. Doty, the devil. He was acting under orders, and UFO groups were and people like Paul Bennewitz were in fact gathering interesting information and classified information that they didn't necessarily want to share with the Soviets. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. And in my paper, I made a case that during the 1980s, it was under the Reagan administration. And the Reagan administration was very highly anti-communist. And I think that they, by supposition, they had a very broad concern with Soviet espionage. And according to an interview that Greg Bishop gave, and Greg Bishop is a friend of Bill Moore, who was a very key figure in all of this during the 1980s, that Greg Bishop said that the idea was to try to find out how many spies were in the U.S. And they decided to use the UFO community in that effort. Now, I also pointed out that, and according to Doty, this whole Bennewitz affair was part of a much larger counterintelligence program. And when you think about it, it could have been a very large effort because you have the aerospace industry, you have the scientific community, you have the engineering community, and there are lots of people that the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, AFOSI could have been monitoring to see what they could find out.
And so this paper that you wrote recently, MJ-12, the counterintelligence angle, talks specifically about MJ-12 and William Moore And I want to talk to you a little bit more about him and the role that he played in this whole thing. What's interesting to me is that folks in the UFO community viewed these interferences as an effort on the part of the government to keep people from learning about UFOs and extraterrestrials, when in fact that wasn't the case at all. It had nothing to do with the extraterrestrials, right?
Well, you can make an argument that there was a counterintelligence effort against, Soviet spies, or possibly leakage of classified information, from classified programs. But at the same time, I would just like to point out, Richard, that it's possible that they were killing more than one bird or with one stone. They could have been accomplishing more than one thing. At the same time, they could have been finding out what the UFO community knew about UFOs. They could be getting information about UFO sightings and events from the UFO community. And it's possible that there was an intention to leak some information about what the government knew about UFOs. Now that's a little bit of speculation, but they could have been accomplishing those two things at the same time.
That makes sense. So let's talk about William Moore then, because wasn't that sort of his role? He made a deal with the devil. Is that an accurate assessment of the way in which Mr. Moore was working with the intelligence community?
Yes, he did undertake a relationship, at least with AFOSI, through his what I call his controller, which he codenamed Falcon. And Moore was a very competent and even a brilliant UFO researcher and investigator. And his intention was to get to the bottom of what the U.S. government knew about UFOs and extraterrestrial contacts and all of that.
And what was the deal that he made?
Well, the deal that he made was that he would inform on Paul Bennewitz, how their countermeasures were doing, against Paul Bennewitz, and that he would inform on things that were going on in UFO groups, particularly APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization that Bill Moore was on the board of, and that he would inform on the activities of certain individuals in the UFO community. And in return, he would receive, quote unquote, inside information about what the government knew about UFOs. And this resulted in a number of documents that were coming through the pipeline to Bill Moore, both privately and later what we found out publicly. And those documents were...
We're talking about the MJ-12 papers, right?
Yes. It started with the so-called Aquarius telex that AFOSI instructed Bill Moore to pass to Paul Bennewitz, apparently with the hope that it would discredit him after he went public with it. And the problem was that Bill Moore knew that the document had been altered, and he warned Paul Bennewitz about that, and Bennewitz never did make it public. The document did become public later, after Bill Moore had the document stolen out of his car, and then it surfaced some months later. Another document that was involved was the so-called Carter briefing document. And that's a paper that Bill Moore had an opportunity to see, and he photographed it in a hotel room under rather cloak and dagger circumstances. That same document was also shown to Linda Howe at an office, an AFOSI office there on Kirtland Air Force Base. So those two documents came into play, and then we had the so-called MJ-12 documents, which Bill Moore received through his associate Jamie Chandray. They received a roll of 35 millimeter film with two documents on that in December of 1984. but Moore sat on the documents for 2.5 years, researching the contents of the Eisenhower briefing document and the Truman-Forrestal memo. Meanwhile, I believe that AFOSI, either through Doty or someone else, leaked these MJ-12 documents to Timothy Good in 1987 when he was getting ready to go public with his book, Above Top Secret. And at that point, the documents became public because Bill Moore had to, show his hand, knowing that Timothy Good was coming out with his book.
Were there differences between what Good got and what Mr. Moore received?
I don't know, because I know that Good received the Eisenhower briefing document. I'd have to go back to Above Top Secret and see if he included the Truman-Forrestal memo.
I believe he did.
What we don't know is if he received any other documents in addition to that, because I don't think Good has ever published those, if he did. And also, Good has only stated that he received it from an intelligence source. Now, I've heard one contention that Richard Doty leaked them to Timothy Good through an intermediary, but I don't have proof of that.
I've also heard Colonel John Alexander talk about this particular thing, and he, from what I recall, stated that the documents that were shown to Linda Moulton Howe differed in some ways from the documents that were provided to Mr. Moore and Mr. Good. Do you know anything about that?
The document that I know was shown to Linda Howe is referred to as the Carter briefing document. And in some other checking that I've done, I've run across the contention that there are actually two versions of that document.
Yes.
So that is possible. But at the same time, if the briefing occurred, there's a possibility that certain people, the briefers, gave an oral briefing, or if they provided documentation, they weren't able to retain it. And then they went back and reconstructed it based on their memory. And that's one reason why there may be more than one version of that document.
And trying to construct a document from memory, as we all know, unless you have a photographic memory, is somewhat of a futile endeavor, right?
Well, it helps if you have more than one person trying to do it.
No, I think it's sad. Let's talk about the MJ-12 papers themselves. Moore received those in the mail, as you said, right, on a roll of 35 millimeter film, and those included what we refer to as the MJ-12 papers and Psalm 101. Is that correct?
Psalm 101 was later. Psalm 101 arose. Now, let me backtrack a little bit. Moore received what we refer to now as the MJ-12 documents. He received those in late 1984, and they were made public in 1987, spring of 1987. The Psalm 1-01 document did not appear until the 1990s, and interestingly, it was mailed to Don Berliner, who is a UFO writer and researcher. It was mailed to Don Berliner under similar circumstances. He received a 35 millimeter roll of film with the Psalm 101 manual on it. And I believe that Stan Friedman referred Berliner to Robert Wood, and Robert Wood took the ball with that.
Robert Wood attempted to authenticate, along with his son, authenticate the MJ-12 papers and that SOM 101, right?
Yes.
What ultimately, I think, Dr. Wood, Robert determined that he believed that the documents were authentic. Do you have any opinions about that? I'm sure that you do, based upon all your research. Have you reached any conclusions yourself about whether you believe in particular, the MJ-12 documents produced to Mr. Moore and Psalm 101 or Psalm 101 are authentic documents?
Richard, I try not to take a hard line, and I review the literature, on this subject. The thing about the Eisenhower briefing document is it has not stood up under scrutiny. People have found, 20 things wrong with it. Same thing with the Truman Forrestal memo and the Cutler 20 memo, which I haven't mentioned, but it arose in 1987. It was found by Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray at the National Archives. So these documents are questioned. Now, as for the Psalm 1-01 document, Jan Aldrich has a long list of things that he found wrong with it. So there are two different issues as I see it, Richard. One is the document itself authentic? And the second is, did MJ-12 or something like it exist? And I think those are really two separate issues.
I agree. Let me ask you this. Why would the intelligence community, if it was the intelligence community, I think that's actually maybe just an assumption, but why would the intelligence community provide those kinds of documents to Mr. Moore or to anyone else? Why would they produce these false documents? What would be, in your opinion, the ultimate reason why they would do that?
There are a couple of possibilities. The UFO community would like to believe that there's a long-term program of kind of a backdoor program of disclosure, of leaking information into the public domain in such a way that plausible deniability is maintained, but at the same time, the seeds of the truth are being planted in the public's mind. And over a long period of time, the public becomes acclimated to the idea. Now, we know that those of us in the UFO community, we're very used to the idea of extraterrestrial visitation and aliens and the government recovering crashed saucers and all of this. And it's also true to a lesser extent in the larger public, because they've been exposed to, the X-Files and all of Ancient Aliens and all of these programs that they see on TV. So these notions have definitely seeped into the popular consciousness and the public imagination. Another explanation is that these counterintelligence programs are continuing and had been continuing. And maybe the plan was to create so much misinformation and confusion. It's like, how an octopus or a squid, they emit a cloud of ink to obscure the situation. And this whole mass of disinformation and misinformation and half-truths and lies and evasions and obfuscations, maybe it serves a purpose of keeping the UFO community off balance, and essentially the public doesn't know what to believe.
So
clearly, I know I said that was a mouthful.
Yeah, well, it's depressing because clearly, well, and after you and I have both done this for a long time, you've done it for much longer than I have, but clearly they don't want us to know certain things. But the question is, what are those things they don't want us to know? I mean, do they not want us to know that we're being visited by extraterrestrials because our society may collapse as the result of learning of this? Or are they keeping technology secret? Or are they keeping our own technology secret from us so that we're not telling all of our enemies how really good our technology is? Or is it a combination of all those things?
I think it could be a combination of all of the above or none of the above. But, kind of like a college exam question. But no, I think you're on the right track there, Richard. That's a good observation. And I think that all of those could be true. That they want us to be confused about what is known about extraterrestrial visitation, assuming that it's ongoing. And they don't want it known as to what level of technology we've achieved, and so on and so forth.
Well, I agree with your assessments of the MJ12 papers and and Psalm 101. I think that there have been a lot of questions arising about their authenticity. I remember Robert Wood talking about, the raised letter R in a particular typewriter had to have been used to produce, I believe it was the Psalm document, but you alluded to something earlier, which was that there probably is something like MJ12 out there, a master group that controls the information around UFOs. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I don't know. It's certainly a possibility, but it all relies on the ultimate facts of the Roswell case. If they recovered a UFO and bodies and maybe even a live alien, then it's almost certain that really a very, very high level of security would have been clamped on that they would have been engaging in extreme secrecy about it.
Yeah. You would think that due diligence would require the formation of a group of that nature, at least with respect to an extraterrestrial spacecraft crashing. You would think that the government would immediately respond by forming some kind of a task group to deal with the information and make a determination and make recommendations to the president, the Pentagon, about what action should be taken in response to that.
Well, and one of the rumors, some of the information that was put out during this phase in the 1980s was that the so-called Project Aquarius was actually a summation of everything that had been learned up to that point. And it was in the document was actually in a ring binder that's maybe a foot thick. And that it was being archived at Bolling Air Force Base, which is now Joint Base Anacostia Bolling Air Force Base here at Washington, D.C. And that, that information was being kept there. And that only, maybe 12 people were read into the program. So just a very few people, and that it was attached to the National Security Council. Well, I've been thinking lately, Richard, that maybe Majestic 12, MJ12, was a nickname, because when I first got here and I went to the National Archives, I went through hundreds of pages of minutes of the Executive Council of the Research and Development Board. And the Research and Development Board had just, I don't know how many committees, scores, if not hundreds, of different committees. And these committees had normal sounding names, like the Guided Missile Research Committee or the Radar, Research Committee or something. You look at government committees and they're never called things like the Magnificent Seven or the Dirty Dozen or the Majestic 12, okay? And that sounds more like a nickname that people would whisper next to the water cooler at the office, okay? So maybe that has something to do with it. And it may or may not have been a fixed committee. It may have just been that certain people within the governmental matrix, the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, certain intelligence agencies, that maybe only 12 people were read into it. And that's where the idea of the MJ12 may have come from.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that Bob Lazar talks about, and I don't know what you think about Bob Lazar, but Bob Lazar talked about working in a secret facility at S4, which is, according to him, was at another dry lake bed called Papoose, Dry Lake, which is south of Area 51, and he claimed that when he was working there, he had a badge, and on his badge it said MAJ, and he always assumed that it referred to majestic or magic or something of that nature. But I think, and I'd like your take on this, I think there may be a little bit of confusion there about magic and majestic 12, because I think magic, MAJIC, probably stands for something like Majority Agents Joint Intelligence Committee, which may not necessarily be the same thing as the majestic 12 or MJ12. You have a take on that?
Well, and that is true. I've heard that story that Bob Lazar has said that, and that it spelled MAJ. But I think we need to remember that MAJ is a term that's used in the military and the government, and it stands for major, like you have MAJCOM, Major Command. Mm-hmm. So just because it says MAJ doesn't necessarily mean that it's referring to Majestic 12 or Magic, even though it might have been referring to that. And after what I said about MJ12 or Majestic 12 maybe being a nickname, maybe it's possible that the Magic, the MAJIC, was an actual security caveat, that was stamped on documents. So those are a couple of possibilities there.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about Richard Doty. Have you had any contact with Richard?
I have a little bit of contact. I do from time to time ask him a question. He does give me the courtesy of answering, but there are very short answers. He does not ever try to contact me, and I can't say, that we're friends or anything like that. But at least he gives me the courtesy of replying if I do send him a message. He does provide some information based on what I've asked, but it's not a lot of information.
Let's go back to 1989. And William Moore speaks at the 1989 MUFON Symposium. And he tells everybody at the symposium that he's been working for the government. and he sort of explains this deal, right? Do you remember that? And what do you think the impact of that was on the UFO community?
It was explosive. I mean, the UFO community has never been the same. And you don't have to be a genius to know that people in the UFO world think that there are all of these conspiracies and that we're being monitored and surveilled and all of this. And some of that may actually be true. But Moore decided to spill the beans. And the closer that I look at this whole affair, Richard, the more inclined I am to think that Moore got burned for a couple of reasons. For one thing, when certain documents came into this pipeline during this whole affair, it's my humble opinion that AFOSI and whomever wanted this information out into the public. Now, in the case of the Aquarius telex, it was altered and given to Bill Moore to pass on to Paul Bennewitz with the expectation that Paul Bennewitz would go public, wave this thing and say, look, see, there are real UFOs. I have proof. With hopefully the intention of discrediting him. But Moore warned him off, and that never went public. Then some months later, Moore had a copy of it in his car in San Francisco. His car was broken into, and it ended up with Peter Gersten, who was a person involved in all of this. And it thus became introduced into the UFO community that way. Secondly, Moore did receive these MJ12 documents in 1984, and he sat on them for 2.5 years and didn't make them public until he was basically forced to. So I think there may have been some discord between Moore and his controllers. In fact, I wonder if the date format on the Eisenhower briefing document was designed to burn Moore, because Moore dated some of his letters the same way, and he's been accused because of that of forging the MJ-12 documents. So maybe when Moore gave his expose in 1989, that was his touche. They burned him and he burned them.
Moore obviously was treated very unfairly. Would you say that's fair?
Yes and no. I think he's a brilliant guy. He did brilliant work in UFO investigation. The perception is that he was arrogant. He played a lot of games. He upset a lot of people. A lot of people felt betrayed. So I think there are two sides to that.
Mm-hmm. Would it be fair to say that Mr. Moore didn't necessarily, and this comes out in what you're saying, didn't necessarily trust his handlers?
Perhaps, because they were playing games with him. It's when he first was recruited, they gave him a document ostensibly from government files, and he went and investigated it and found out that virtually none of it was true. And he went back to them, pretty angry. And they said, well, that was a test and you passed the test. So they were testing him. They were probably surveilling him. If the government people were behind the theft of his briefcase out of his car, then that means he was under surveillance. They were following him. Paul Bennewitz was definitely under surveillance. His phones were tapped. They were opening his mail. They were, surveilling him from across the street. So, these are some kind of ugly things that were going on.
Let me ask you, Tom, why your fascination with MJ-12? What is it about MJ-12 that draws your attention? Why are you spending so much time on it?
First of all, I'm fascinated by the possibility that the intelligence agencies are messing with the U.S. public, especially through documents. And what adds another layer of fascination is that it might have something to do with UFOs. There's the possibility that maybe there are US UFO secrets that are being kept. But also, these counterintelligence and disinformation and deception operations could be conducted to protect U.S. technological secrets. And that makes a lot of sense when you're talking about foreigners. But what intrigues me is that the U.S. public could also be an adversary from the point of view of the intelligence agencies. And Barry Greenwood and Brad Sparks wrote a brilliant paper about the origins of MJ-12. And they explicitly described how there was bad blood between the Air Force and the Navy, and that the Air Force was getting extremely concerned about Jimmy Carter wanting to reopen the UFO investigations. And the Air Force had good reason to dislike the UFO community. And in the late 70s and early 80s, there were all of these Freedom of Information Act requests going on, and UFO researchers were swarming all over the place trying to get information out of the Air Force and out of the government. So I'm fascinated by this prospect of the U.S. government using countermeasures against U.S. citizens
to keep them from learning the truth, or to I call it peeing in the pool. To, as you mentioned earlier, to sort of cloud the waters, to sow confusion so that no one's able to really reach any solid conclusions about anything.
Yes, and I think that's been extremely successful, assuming that those programs have been conducted, which I think they have.
Mm-hmm. And so ultimately what we find out is that, and I can tell you that when I did some work for Dr. Greer was legal counsel for the Orion project, and we had a meeting in Miami, and I believe we were followed. I do believe that that there was some interest at that time, and probably still is in what Dr. Greer is doing, and we were being monitored during that particular meeting in Miami. So I know that the intelligence community and has some interest in what UFO folks are doing, people related to this, but ultimately the question I continue to come up with is why? Is it because they don't want us to know the truth, which is the question I asked you a little bit earlier? Do they not want us to know the truth, or are they just, And another thing we need to think about is that the intelligence community is so vast, and you may have several different agencies interested in a particular topic for many different reasons, and they're not necessarily talking to each other, right?
Yes, true. And a really great book is The U.S. Intelligence Community by Jeffrey Rickelson. And I've been reading that, and I'll tell you, Richard, it's just on the basis of the intelligence organizations, and we're not even talking military, the regular conventional military, just on the basis of the intelligence organizations, the information is overwhelming. And they're constantly being reorganized, especially the military. And you've got to be really sharp to keep up with all of the changes that go on with the military intelligence divisions and the other public intelligence organizations.
Now, are you going to continue to work on the MJ-12 issue, or much more broadly on the intelligence issue and how the intelligence community relates to the UFO community?
Both. Because I think that they are related. I'm going to continue to work on the MJ-12 controversy, and I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. Now, we don't have anyone that is admitted to forging the MJ-12 documents. There are a couple that we can be pretty sure can be traced back to AFOSI. But like I said, I'm going to be writing white papers. I keep a list of topics to base these papers on. I've got a list of 5, 6, 7, 8 papers that I want to write already, and this list will probably grow as time goes along. And I'm going to be busy on this for a long time. Now it's frustrating that I can't get into the National Archives and check certain things. Now, there's nothing about MJ-12 in there, but there's information about the military and so on and so forth that I could be checking, and I can't get in there because of COVID. And the same thing with the Library of Congress. And I'm going to go broke trying to buy all these books that are related to the subject that I'm in. So if I can just get back into the Library of Congress, some of them are, in that system, and I can get a hold of the books that way. So I just wish they'd open back up.
Let's talk about big picture stuff for a second, Tom. Let's get back to the basic issue of extraterrestrial visitations, advanced spacecraft, and that sort of thing. What do you think about us being visited? Have you concluded, or do you believe that we're being visited by people from somewhere else?
I'm convinced that the UFO phenomenon is real, that it's material, and that it's important. We don't, in my humble opinion, we don't have proof or even direct physical evidence, unless the government has something, that the UFO people are extraterrestrial in origin. However, that seems to be the common sense answer to that mystery. But we have to hold out the possibility that there may be an element to this that we do not understand. For example, some kind of interdimensional relationship that we don't understand yet. But I definitely feel that the phenomenon is real. But to be honest, I don't think we have enough information yet
Yeah.
to know the origin and the ultimate nature of the phenomenon itself.
I think that's obviously going to take a long time. I would encourage you. Have you seen James Fox's new film, The Phenomenon?
Yes, I've seen it, and I had the privilege of serving on a discussion panel that he was a member of, and I thought he was a really great guy. He spent an awful lot of time on it. I think he must have spent upwards 6 years or more trying to get the thing made. They did a wonderful job of bringing up archival footage of things that we normally don't get to see, of people that have been involved in the field.
I was particularly interested in the last few minutes of the film. I guess it was about 3/4 of the way through when they had Dr. Nolan on to talk about his analysis of the materials that were brought to him by Jacques Vallée. And they did the analysis on the materials, and he determined that the samples that he was looking at came from a place that had up to 250 elements, and that the isotopic ratios in the materials that he was observing, even though they contained some elements that we were familiar with, their isotopic ratios were completely askew, completely different than what you would expect of elements that were found on Earth. Does that prove the case?
I think what proves the case in my mind is that what they seem to have discovered is that there was a manufacturing process in place that is way beyond anything that we're capable of. I mean, they're manufacturing the materials on a nano level, on a molecular layer level, and that's obviously way beyond anything that we have yet. And I'm glad that they discussed that, and we hear rumors and talk about the analysis of these materials. And I think if it can be made public and it can be verified by other scientists, without any dispute, then I think that would go a long way to prove the case.
Interestingly, with regard to those materials, it still doesn't necessarily, I think as you say, I think you're correct about this, it doesn't necessarily prove the extraterrestrial hypothesis in light of everything that we know and that we've learned about this particular subject. It may be that these materials are manufactured in an adjacent reality rather than, billions of miles away, light years away on some other planet that has these elements. As Bob Lazar would say, he believes that, I don't know that he believes this, but of the documents that he was given access to when he allegedly worked at S4 said that the materials came from a star system, a binary star system, where elements like element 115 could be formed because of the nature of the gravitational forces in play in that binary star system, and they ended up creating heavier elements that may end up just being deposited in some of their planets, just naturally occurring. But that's all just speculation. We don't know that what he read in the documents that he was given access to were actually the truth, and it may be something very, very similar to what Mr. Moore was exposed to, just disinformation, so that if he ever did get out and he would say this, in fact, it was something completely different.
And that's if he saw those documents at all. We have to take his word for it.
Right.
Because we're not able to verify his claims.
Yeah, that's right. So what does the future hold for you, Tom? What are you going to be working? Are you going to be working on this forever? I mean, clearly you enjoy it, and I love to see the light in your eyes when you talk about doing this kind of research. So, is this your plan?
Yeah, I like to say that I've reached my happy hunting grounds. I'm doing what I love. I'm passionate about it. Because of the format of things that I'm working on, it provides motivation. I can't wait to get up in the morning and work on it. Unfortunately, I don't have as much energy as I had when I was younger. And I have some limitations there. But yes, I've been working on a very detailed timeline of the Bennewitz affair. I'm working on a paper that I'm calling Before MJ12 because there were a series of events and activities that were interesting before the MJ12 controversy arose, but that I think are either related directly or indirectly to it. And I'm going to be working on other papers. For example, there's the psychological warfare dimension to the MJ12 controversy, and there's the so-called Men in Black. That's kind of a colloquialism, but it's there's at least one section in the Air Force that conducts deception operations, and they use people that are con men and actors. And there is a history of certain intimidation of UFO witnesses, through UFO history. So there are a lot of things that I can work on, and that doesn't even include getting into the content and the forensics of the MJ12 documents themselves. And there are a whole lot of documents even after Bill Moore's sequence. We had the Psalm 101. We had all the documents that came from Timothy Cooper. We have Serpo, and even in 2017, another document arose that I call the Ultra Top Secret document. And then recently, I was watching Linda Howe video, and she was waving a pretty thick document that she said is an MJ12 related paper. So, there's plenty of material out there to work with.
And ultimately, what is your goal, Tom? Do you want to prove to the rest of us that, well, you don't have to prove it to me, but do you want to prove to the rest of us that this is not only a real phenomenon, but there are forces far beyond our understanding at play here? Or is it your goal to bring a greater understanding to folks like us?
I think to bring a greater understanding. And after I've written enough white papers, a quantity of them, then I have the basics for a book. And of course, all of that would need to be rewritten. But, I could form that into a book, and that would be my intellectual legacy.
Yeah. And so what is it specifically that you're working on right now, right this very minute, aside from the podcast?
The Bennewitz timeline. And I've gone through all of the available literature that I can reasonably get a hold of, and I'm up to about 10 references right now. And I've created an extremely detailed timeline of this whole affair between 1979 and 1989. Mm-hmm. And once I get it all organized in presentable format, I will post it on my blog along with a white paper that goes along with it. And there's going to be a whole lot of information in there.
Okay. Now, Tom, can you do me a favor and remind everyone once again how they can get to the material that you're writing?
I'm on Facebook, as Tom Whitmore. I'm on Twitter as at Tom Tulsa. And my blog is tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. That's tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com.
And you've got a ton of stuff on your blog, and in particular, most recently, your work on MJ12, the counterintelligence angle. That was an article, a white paper from September 10th. And you've also written a number of other articles that I would encourage people to go to your blog and read. Tom is a meticulous researcher, and his writing is excellent. Tom, I appreciate you being with me here today. I really do.
Thank you, Richard. I'm so appreciative that you've had me on your program today.
Well, I'm going to have you back again. I really like having you on, and we'll talk again. As a matter of fact, I think we'll probably see each other tomorrow.
Yes, we will. But we won't be talking about MJ12.
Right. Unfortunately.
Okay.
All right. Well, I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You betcha. And I'll be back in a few minutes with some afterthoughts.
You are not alone. Thousands of people all over the world have sightings of UFOs per month. MUFON is the place to report them. Since 1969, MUFON has been investigating UFO reports and providing this information to the public. Our aim is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity. Support UFO research. Join MUFON today.
Hi everybody, Richard Beckwith here, coming to you from an undisclosed location somewhere in the solar system, encouraging you to tune in every Sunday night at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern for the official MUFON podcast. You can listen to us on Spreaker, iTunes, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And you can watch us right here on the MUFON YouTube channel. Make sure to like and subscribe.
You are listening to the official podcast of the Mutual UFO Network.
Whether what we refer to as MJ12 is real or not, as a government lawyer, I can tell you that when government is confronted with a problem, the first thing you do is form a committee to make recommendations. If an alien spacecraft was to crash somewhere, and you weren't necessarily prepared for that possibility, the logical thing to do would be to keep the information secret and immediately form a multidisciplinary committee to make recommendations about how to handle the information gleaned from it. The research Tom is doing gives us glimpses into the lengths to which governments will go to keep things secret, not only from our adversaries, but from the American people. That is not to say that that is always a bad thing. What state would the world be in if, say, North Korea could deliver a nuclear weapon in the blink of an eye using advanced alien technology? Any random madman could hold the world hostage, or worse, destroy it altogether. I would say that we'd better all pray there's a group like MJ12 protecting those secrets. For UFO researchers like Tom Whitmore, the truth lies hidden beneath layers of secrecy that only dogged, relentless, meticulous research can penetrate. Thank you all for joining us once again. If you're watching us on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next week, right here on the official MUFON podcast.